So the one thing is repetition. Every month you should have content for people to engage with, shared definitions so people know what you mean by diversity. And then I think a few terms like microaggression, bias, privilege, that they can use so they can say, oh, I participated in the event. And then I thought about, could I see forms of bias and privilege in the content? Now I'm applying the learning. That's the thing. You have to use the skill and know what tool I'm supposed to be using. And so that's the point of the repetition, is because one-time training doesn't work. And I always tell people, like, I can't make you racist in 45 minutes. So I can't undo racism in 45 minutes. That's why a one-time session doesn't work.
Hi everyone, welcome back to the All Inclusive podcast. On today's episode, I'm joined by Jason Thompson, author of Diversity and Inclusion Matters, Tactics and Tools to Inspire, Equity and Game-Changing Performance. In this episode, we dive into Jason's inspiring journey and the motivations behind his book. We also explore the alternative solutions for combating unconscious bias in recruitment and the practical strategies that organisations can adopt to foster a more inclusive hiring process. As always, before jumping into the video, make sure to hit that subscribe button, turn on your notification bell, and follow on your favourite podcast platform so that you never miss an episode. That being said, let's jump in. Hi, Jason.
How are you?
I'm good. How are you today?
Doing good. Thanks for having me.
No, thanks so much for joining me. So why not kick things off, tell our listeners a little bit about you and also the inspiration for the book.
Yeah, I guess I'm slightly unusual in that I've been doing diversity almost 30 years. A lot of people think of diversity, equity, inclusion as kind of a new thing, but it was literally my first job out of college like 30 years ago. And but the last probably 10, 15 years, I've been launching diversity programs. So I've started from scratch. You show up and then go, hey, we need a diversity program. Here's a very small budget, a computer and a desk. Good luck. And I learned a lot through that process, the last 10 or 15 years. And then Wiley, the book publisher, kind of got word of that I've been doing this, and people had been reaching out to me to help them and asked me to write a book. And so I started writing it, partly because it's just practical. What I found is most diversity books are very theoretical, and not that that's bad, but they typically speak like diversity is important. Well, yeah, great. But if you need CEO commitment, what are you supposed to do? Like, what does that actually mean in a very tangible way? And so that was kind of the inspiration of the book, is just lessons learned. As you probably know, diversity officers in the US anyway last about 18 months, high turnover. And I would say that's a lot of it just because there's no textbook that helps you. Most of it's theoretical. Like, it's important, but you don't know what you're supposed to do. And so that's what the goal of the book is, to, answer those simple questions of what to do on a regular basis.
Oh, fantastic. And I think in today's rapidly changing world, we know that there's one tool that works in one way for diversity, another tool that works to create inclusive environments, and there's a lot that's happening, and it's ever changing because we know that there's things in politics, different policies, laws come in place. So how does your book kind of contribute to that ever changing landscape that we're in when it comes to diversity and inclusion?
Yeah, you're going to find that the book, Diversity and Inclusion Matters, super practical. And essentially what I did is figure out what data you should collect. And almost in any program, like, the program can be unique to the company, but a lot of the fundamentals are actually the same. And so for me, basically the first 5 chapters are what I call CAPE: collect, analyze, plan, execute, and use that CAPE technique to build a diversity program. Because what I find is, and this is, I always say, diversity is actually the outcome of managing who gets promoted, how long they stay, and how they leave. So if it's termination, voluntary, involuntary. And if you manage that, the outcome will be diversity. Most people think, oh, I just create a diversity plan, and then it starts falling apart because they don't actually know what the problem is. And so for me, if you organize the data up front, and I talk about how to do that in the book, and you manage those levers, you're not going to be surprised. And then you can tailor something to the unit, to the organization, that can be very effective. So I think the fundamentals are the same, but what happens is people don't know how to use those to uniquely create a plan that looks like the organization that they're in.
And why do you think, and just, I think with the cape that you have, which is in the book, I think it's great. I'm curious to hear from you, because you've been doing this work for so long. Why do you think that is? Like, why haven't we seen? Why isn't there enough resource out there available?
Well, it's a relatively new industry, and I think a lot of it too initially was um, I don't think people really thought like on a very practical way to think about it. Like people knew theoretically, and they started doing a lot of research on why we should do diversity, rather than okay, great, we've agreed it's good. What are we supposed to do? Like we haven't quite transitioned that, and I think we're in that point now where people are transitioning to, well, what are we supposed to do? And people are really starting to struggle with. Um, like everyone, I think knew we should write a diversity plan. I mean, I remember everybody was writing diversity plans, but I don't think anybody really did the math on it. Like, how does a diversity plan work? What should be in it? And I use the word math because I'm very data based, but I do think that's one of the misses. And one of my examples would be, and I see this all the time, I consult with different organizations. And I remember an organization said to me one day, well, I just got hired chief diversity officer. They had a diversity plan. I just followed the plan they had, and the plan was focused on recruitment. And my take was, well, great. How do you know you have a recruitment problem? And her response was, I don't. I guess I hadn't thought of that. And you could see the weakness right there. If you build a whole thing on recruitment and you don't have a recruitment problem, you're not going to get outcomes. And most organizations do this all the time. And there's actually data you should collect to know whether or not you have a recruitment problem. Because a lot of times what happens is, and this is what they were experiencing, this is why they reached out because it was falling apart. People are applying for the job. They had a diversity of people applying for the job. They weren't being hired. So they don't have a diversity recruitment problem. They had
Mm.
selection bias. And so therefore you need to do, unconscious bias training, talk about that. That would actually fix your problem. But because they never collected the data, they were fixing a problem that didn't exist. It's an assumption a lot of people make. We're not diverse. It's a recruitment issue. And many times that's actually not what's going on. People are applying for the jobs. They're just never being seen by the hiring manager, or the hiring manager sees them, just never chooses them.
Mm. And I'm going to go down a little bit of a recruitment rabbit hole a
Sure.
bit. So, how we know collecting data is important, and I agree. I
Mhm.
think you
Yep.
need to know the landscape of your business, where those pain points are, in order to kind of build from there. Um,
Sure.
with recruitment, you talk about the selection process, and actually, you've got diverse people that are applying, but they're not actually going anywhere.
Yep.
They're not reaching the next stage. So how would you address that aside from unconscious bias training? Because I feel like that's the key one, like we know, and a lot of
Sure.
organizations do it. I'm not discounting that it's not beneficial and it shouldn't be on there, but
I get it.
I'm curious to hear from you other ways to solve that problem.
Well, one of the things I do is you'll find I'm super practical. And one of the things you need to do is accountability. So if I have data, I can say to a manager, it's interesting. You had 10 opportunities to hire and you never hired a woman. I actually remember I actually had this situation years ago where somebody had 18 straight hires, not one person of color. I was like, that outcome's mathematically impossible. Just so you know, we're holding you accountable to this. Just out of randomness and the candidates we've been presenting to you, I know that outcome has to show bias. We are going to hold you accountable to it. You'd be surprised how quickly that changes people's behavior,
Mm.
because it's hard to argue that kind of math when it's like, well, how do you go 18 straight hires, no women, or 18 straight, no people of color? And we know candidates were presented to you. That's clearly bias. We think you should hire at a rate that's equivalent to the appearance of any particular candidate in the market. So, for example, it's theoretically possible that if you're an engineering firm where we know women are underrepresented, that if you made hires, you might only hire one woman, because women in some depending on industry only make up 10%. So out of 10 hires, one would actually make sense. That's what we hold you to. But if you go 18-0, we're telling that's a whole different story. Something else is going on.
Yeah.
Like out of 18, we're probably closer to 2, maybe 3, but none would reflect bias. So that's how we try to push on that, is this, and we try to show they're in the pool, right? Now, as a leader, they have every right. So I never saw any candidates or any women that would make sense, but that's where we track it. And that's how we do it. And we actually call it an equity table. We're not saying we guarantee this diversity, but what we are saying is just out of random selection, 0% is an outcome that is actually impossible, like just out of randomness.
Yeah.
Uh, and so that's how we start balancing and helping leaders understand what's expected of them, how we hold them accountable. Sometimes you get pushback. Well, this is a quota, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, well, you can call it what you want, but we're just saying this is simple math and randomness. You can't keep getting this outcome and assume it's random. It's no longer random. There's intent. And that intent is what concerns us.
What would you say would be a good period to go, like time period to wait before you reflect on where you're at, if that makes sense. So
Yeah.
say you've run the data, okay, these are what our numbers are saying. As you said, look, you need to work on this. You've not hired enough black people. Like, we're at 0%. This
Yeah.
isn't what you should be doing. Okay, great. We go away. How long is it? Do you wait before you start looking? Okay, where are we at now?
Well, it depends on the size of the companies, how many hires you make. So, for example, you could be only hiring 2 people a year, right? So we just do it annually. We just check and show, and generally annually typically works for most companies, right? We let you know at the beginning of the year what you look like. Sometimes we check in at 6 months. We check in a year later, and the reality for us, and this is what I call an equity table, is we also put in the context the fact that if you only make 2 hires a year, it is possible that you wouldn't hire a person of color, just depending on the industry. I mean, and that's where we check it, and then we track we track it over several years, so we can say, well, now we're trending 3 years straight over 6 hires. It's starting to look like there's a pattern here. So it depends on the organization how many hires, but that's why I always say it's an equity. We look at other levers. It could be that you don't hire any women because you only had 1 hire to make in 3 years, but women should be getting promotions. There's other levers, and so we look at how does a employee experience your organization. So that would be, well, are people getting promoted? Are they staying relatively the same amount of time as their peers? Do we see high turnover? And are they leaving because they're being fired? Right. So all those levers, to me, you have to put in a context.
Mm.
And that's why it's an equity table. We're trying to measure how are people experiencing our organization? And so that's when we sit down with leaders, that's what we show them, basically, this entire experience. And then your job as a leader is to manage those experiences. And we know what the metrics is, because we use some comparators so that it's fair. And generally, that holistic view, we find, becomes much more empowering for leaders. Actually, we rarely get much pushback when people see that, because hiring is a function of who's available in the market. So it could be low, but that doesn't mean people shouldn't be getting promotions. Doesn't mean we should have high turnover, right? It's all those things that a manager has to manage.
Yeah. And for you personally, like, what have you found to be the most impactful program or initiative that really creates the cultural change within an organization? I know it is going to be dependent on that
Sure.
particular organization, but
Yeah.
for you, in kind of overall, what would you say? I guess one thing probably is going to be difficult to pinpoint,
Sure.
but what would you say is a key step or action that you found to make the most difference when going
Yeah.
into an
So
organization?
what I've done is, well, there's a couple of things. One is I use the data. I think data is helpful because almost everybody can relate to data.
Yeah, yeah.
The second thing is, at the end of the day, and I write about this in the book, what a diversity program does is it creates cultural change. There are principles and all kinds of theories around how to create cultural change, organizational change. I use the example of ADKAR. So for me, ADKAR is an acronym for awareness. I can't remember all the terms, but anyway, it's all written up in the book. But the ADKAR is a process where we move away from one-time mandatory training and move to regular training every month. Because one of the things you want to do is create the awareness. Hey, this is happening. We're changing in this direction. This is a commitment we made. And so an employee can say, oh, I should align myself with this if I want to do well. Just like you align yourself to the vision and mission of the organization if you want to do well. One of the ways to do that is to understand our diversity, equity, and inclusion. Then we click spaces so the awareness can then move into action. Like I attend the sessions. The attention gives me the knowledge. The knowledge means I can actually apply the skill. And so we've moved away from one-time training. We've moved to a regular interaction with content, because the goal is we want organizational change. One-time training doesn't work. And I always joke about this, but it's true. I can't do my own travel. Like, you have to submit your travel like once a month, whatever it is, whenever you travel, right? And the reason I can't do it is because I never use it. Like, I get a one-time training and then I might not travel for 3 or 4 months. And then it's like, oh my gosh, I can't remember what I'm supposed to do.
Yeah.
That's why one-time training doesn't work, right? Because I can't remember how to do travel. I don't use it. So if they get a one-time training on diversity, it doesn't work, because it's like 6 months later, I make a hire. People are like, I don't
No, yeah.
remember. I just go
I mean,
back to
I
whatever.
remember when I go on, like, it's the same, I guess, when with anything, when you leave work, say you go on
Yeah,
on annual leave for a significant period
yeah,
of time. Even when I went on maternity leave for like a
yeah,
year, I wasn't doing
yeah.
work. I couldn't even remember what my password was.
Oh, exactly. Yeah.
So yeah, no, I totally get that.
Yeah. Yeah. So we've moved. And so the one thing is repetition. Every month you should have content for people to engage with, shared definitions so people know what you mean by diversity. And then I think a few terms like microaggression, bias, privilege, that they can used so they can say, oh, I participated in the event. And then I thought about, could I see forms of bias and privilege in the content? Now I'm applying the learning. That's the thing. You have to use the skill and know what tool I'm supposed to be using. And so that's the point of the repetition, is because one-time training doesn't work. And I always tell people, like, I can't make you racist in 45 minutes. So I can't undo racism in 45 minutes. That's why a one-time session doesn't work,
Mm.
right? Our beliefs are closely held. It's hard. It's hard to break those beliefs. So it takes repetition. That's what we need to do.
Yeah, and I think, isn't it doesn't research say it takes like 90 days to even stick to like a routine
Yeah,
for our
exactly.
brains to even be able to continue or to start implementing any sort of new routine? It takes about at
Yeah.
least 90 days to do that.
Yeah,
So, yeah,
exactly.
no,
Yeah, and we have built diversity programs on a model that doesn't work. It's a lot of it's focused on one-time training. Like every time something happens, people come to me, oh, Jason, we should train around it. It's like in the US, George Floyd, can't we do a training? We should do a training. Everyone needs training. And I pushed back and I was like, no, what we need is repetition. This isn't the first time we've seen someone, unfortunately, African Americans be killed by police. But because we do one-time training, people think it's fixed. All right. So we've almost enhanced that assumption that these problems are all in the past. When we have a problem, we give you the 45-minute training and then we go on to something else. No, we've not broken the habit.
no, not at all.
Yeah,
Not by a long
exactly.
shot,
Yeah.
but we're making a dent, and that's important. And I agree. I think it's a continuous learning experience,
Yes.
and a one time fix is not going to happen. But
Exactly.
yeah,
Yeah.
I think repetition is important, but repetition costs money,
Yep.
unfortunately. So how would you how would you tackle that? So if, with organisations that um they've got the right sentiment. So I mean, from the moral perspective, they know that it's the right thing to do, but actually, they've done a couple training here, maybe implemented one or two programs, but it is starting to cost quite a lot. So
Yeah.
how would you overcome that pushback in terms of that the finances?
Um, well, my book's quite affordable, so I think they can buy the book. But there's actually there's blatant promotion of the book. But anyway, this is what I recommend. Every time I've had a diversity program, I'm not exaggerating. Regardless of the size of the organization, I usually show up and they go, "Here's your desk, here's your computer, and you get about a $50,000 budget. Make this thing work." And we got 10,000 employees. Like, how am I supposed to make that work? And there actually is ways to do this. And this is why I think most diversity officers fail, is because there's no textbook that tells them. And my book lays this out. Here's what I would do. You can do this very effectively. Number one, you need to have shared language. So you need to give people definitions: diversity, equity, inclusion, microaggression, bias, privilege. And you only need to do like 5 or 6 of them. Then what you do is you need content, but you don't have to have expensive content. It can be, for example, here's a YouTube video where someone's talking about some topic. And then you just have people look at it and go, oh, can you see forms of bias in the presentation? Can you see privilege? Right? Can you see a microaggression? And it could be they don't, which would be totally normal because you have to practice the content. So every month you just say, we just need you to commit 10 or 15 minutes to this content. Or you can even do, hey, a popular movie came out. We're just asking everybody to go to the movie, and then we're going to do a movie session and decompress what we just saw. I mean, some of it is, there's historical movies that came out about certain events that happened, but sometimes it could be like some of these movies that come out, there's like a day in a life, or even a superhero movie. Like you can see a lot of gender bias in superheroes, right? And these things, and you could just have that conversation. Wow, it's a great movie. It's funny. This, or a commercial that comes on TV. There was a commercial in the US about gambling. And essentially they would have a white person sitting on the couch, getting ready to make a bet, but they couldn't figure it out. And then they'd have this black athlete come into the door and take the phone from their hand and show them how to do this, make the bet. But there was implied a very offensive message that black athletes are stupid and even they can use this app. Like there was an underlying message that was very insidious. And the only way the joke actually worked was you have to accept black athletes are stupid. That's what made this funny, because they could grab this phone out of a white person's hand and immediately show them how to do it. And they would say, then, see how easy this is. And the implication was completely offensive. The joke only works if you assume the stereotype about black people,
Yeah.
which was completely missed. They ran it for years. But that commercial just helped me have this conversation about how bias and privilege works. Like, why
Mm.
is this funny? Pause for a minute, look at it. Costs nothing, right? It's already on TV. But all we did is organize the conversations, right? And then we give them a tool. Can you apply this tool to this situation? If you can, then and other things we do as an organization, you can hopefully begin the practice of applying the tool of how do I see microaggression? How do I see privilege? How does it impact how I interact with my coworkers, our customers, etc.?
Oh, that advert. I'm still like, what? I'm still processing.
Oh, yeah.
But no, I agree. I think that it definitely will. It's it sounds so simple when you think about it, but actually it just takes one person creating that idea, and it's great that with the help of your book and what you've just said, these are just very somewhat easy, quick things that you can implement and put together on
Mhm.
a continuous basis, which doesn't
Yeah.
cost anything but time.
Yeah, and I think that's the problem is there hasn't been many textbooks or anything to help people think of what are the things we can do. And because you're right, like a lot of it is expensive. There are companies who have like microaggression sessions and all these things, and I'm not saying you shouldn't buy them. Actually, I mean, I'm a consultant myself, so I get it. These people need their jobs. We need to support them if we can. So I'm not against it, but it can be done. Unfortunately, what happens is the dynamic you get is you don't get much money, and they give you this big task, and you're technically set up to fail. Like most diversity officers we talked about, right? It's high turnover, partly because the light comes on. Like I'm set up here to fail. They want me to do all these things, but they don't give me the funds to do it.
Yeah.
And so the light comes on pretty quickly for people that there's only so much I can do here, but the criteria is so high that I can't meet it, and it's unfair to me. So most people they leave. So
So looking to the future,
mhm.
what would you what changes or improvements would you like to see going forward in the years ahead?
Well, I think obviously it'd be better. It'd be great to have more of a financial commitment from organizations. Like a lot of people said it's important, but they're not putting the money there. So we got to have that. And then I think we've got to start pushing back, at least in the US. There's some legislation that's kind of anti diversity, equity, inclusion. But we need to call that out, not because diversity is important, because that's what fascism and dictatorships look like.
Mm.
When a legislative branch is used to silence the voice of small, underrepresented groups, that's what dictatorships do. That's what fascism looks like. And if you know your history and you look, there's a huge parallel between what's going on in Florida and what's going on, what happened in Germany. I mean, one of the first things they did was make homosexuality illegal. What has Florida done? Can't say gay. All these laws,
Yeah,
right?
I mean, like, there's one where
Direct,
even if
yeah,
you like, I think it was if they if someone is of uh, gay
yeah,
and they have kids and they are supportive of their children,
yeah,
kind of going through a transgender process, anything like
yeah,
that, like that would be illegal, and it would
yeah.
it's
The laws were.
scary.
It's exact. If you look historically, you see the same laws were done in Germany, the same laws, and then they slowly just start dismantling the voice of Jews. What's going on in Florida isn't really about diversity, equity, inclusion. They are dismantling the voice of people of color, systematically doing this in such a way that you end up with Nazi Germany, where if essentially it's the people themselves that becomes illegal. But they didn't do it in one day. And it was this silence from everybody, like, oh, it's not that bad, or that's what they're doing there. I don't live there, kind of thing, that allowed this to grow. And I think as diversity officers, we have to start calling that out. Like there's something more insidious going on here that is fundamentally the opposite of what a free society is based on. So I do think that conversation, and I think it's important too, to why history is so important, because the other thing they've done is they basically are moving history. They're making Black history, removing it from the books. These are all the same techniques that were used. This is how dictatorships are created. This is what fascism looks like, and we need to have that conversation.
Definitely, and I think it starts with the, as you said, diversity, equity, inclusion leaders, to voice
Yes.
um their disgust and what's going on, but also in the same breath, it's for the individual, for us as people, as a society, to say like that's not okay.
Yeah.
Also, and to do as much as we can in our part, because like you said, I agree, like I think America's a very big place, and there's a lot of other places that you can go to where you will feel like you can be your true self, and it's very easy to simply just be like, oh well, I'm just not going to go there.
Exactly. Exactly. And that's
um
such good. That's a very good point.
but I think we need to do more than just not go there. We need to be like, no, that's wrong, and
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
But I've so much enjoyed this conversation, Jason. A couple of more things that I wanted to grab out of you is we've touched a bit on data and analytics, and that we've got to start with the data. What would you say is one of the tools that you've used to be able to gather that? So what the key metrics? What are we actually looking at? What am I pulling?
Yeah. So um, there are a couple things, and it depends on your company, but usually you have a applicant tracking system. So you need to know who's applying for jobs. You need to track race, LGBTQ, whatever information you can get out of that. But there are two things. The easy part essentially is mostly your HR system kind of houses all this. So you need to be able to break down the demographics, but then you need to know who's getting promoted, how long they stay, who gets terminated, and how they get terminated. You then need to have a comparator. So in the US, we have like census data. Um, and you need to compare who's in your organization based on who has a skill set in the world, so you know what's fair. So you can say, we have, like, you see this all the time, 14% of our team is like African Americans, let's say. Is that low or high? Well, technically, African Americans only make 14% of the US population. So 14 actually isn't low. It just feels low.
Yeah.
Right. And it could be not only that, we're an engineering company, and Black engineers only make up 6%. So 14 would actually be very good. So you need to know what the market. Full transparency, that's one of the things we do for people as a consultant. We actually help them figure out what the market is. That's usually the heavier part of the data lift. Getting the internal data is easier because you already have a system to do that, but the comparator takes a lot more work. It's kind of a heavier lift. But once you have that, it makes your life so much easier, because then you know what. And I always say one of the biggest challenges for diversity officers is unrealistic expectations. Because many times what happens is people say, well, women make up 50% of the world. Shouldn't they be 50% of our team? Well, in theory, yes. But 50%, for instance, let's say you have 10 leaders at the vice presidents, right? In an organization, big company, you got 10 vice presidents. And you think, well, half of our vice presidents should be women because women make up half the world. True. But you probably only have 10% turnover, which means you only lose one vice president a year. So to get to 50% could take like 5, 10, maybe never get there, because that would also mean 100% retention of women and only men leave. So one man would have to leave every year for the next 5 years, and only women be hired to get to 50%. The number's unrealistic. Like, you can't actually achieve that. It's not that it's not important, but you have to have realistic expectation to say to the leadership team, your job as leaders to keep good people. Every time you keep good people, it reduces my opportunity to make the place more diverse, because the only way I do it is people have to leave and I got to replace them. That equation, most people just don't understand how it works. If you have a good understanding of that, you can actually set goals that can be achieved. And that's where I think one of the weaknesses has been historically. Most people don't understand that math. It's a simple equation, but most people never think about that. They only think, where are the women? They have to be 50%, which is true. Like, I understand that right in my gut. What I don't understand is that's predicated on turnover. And everybody here as a leader is working to lower turnover, which is exactly means we're working at cross purposes.
Yeah.
I need you to turn people over, right? Nobody wants high turnover.
No.
High turnover is indicative of a company that's failing. If you go to a company and they got 50% turnover, nothing good is going on there. Although you could make the company more diverse because they have that turnover, but the longer that stays, the longer you know the culture's broken. It's not going to work.
And I think that's where it's important to include that in the inclusion piece. I think that's where it's important as also, is that if you're getting all of these people in, like, you still kind of want them to stay there.
Exactly.
So it's definitely something that needs to happen hand in hand. They both go in hand, and clearly within the title, diversity and inclusion.
And inclusive, exactly.
Yeah.
And that's the thing. And that's the data tells you whether or not, do I have a recruitment problem or do I have an inclusion problem? People just don't stay. And that typically is a manager issue. Recruitment is an HR issue, right? And so that's another reason why it's so important to know where the problem is, so you can actually start addressing things in the right place. Because a lot of times an organization isn't diverse. They do all this training in HR. The issue is the managers are the problem, right? They're training the wrong people even, right? They got the wrong. And so, but the data lets us know. And then even like, I tend to be very practical, very direct. A lot of times managers don't know what it is in their behavior that's the problem. That's why I train around microaggression. So I can say, every time we take notes, you look at the woman, take notes. Like, we see this all the time in the US. That's a microaggression. And for many women, they're like, oh my gosh, I'm the senior VP and everyone looks at me and they still want me to take the notes. Really? Like if people don't understand that, that's why most women leave. They're like, yeah, I got sick of the fact that every time I show up, they want to take notes, and like no one gets it here. And then when I say something's wrong with me, the response is, oh, but you have the nicest handwriting, or blah, blah, blah. But it's like, yeah, I'm the vice president here. I'm not here to take notes. I don't do
Yeah.
that. We don't ask the men who are VPs to do that, right? Like just understanding that subtlety, what microaggression means. Because many times what happens is if a woman does voice that, it's not received well because the other leaders who are men don't understand what a microaggression is. So you have to start in the middle, which is hard instead of the beginning because they don't have the vocabulary. I got to start at the beginning instead of the middle, right? I got to give you the vocabulary what a microaggression is in the first place. And then they go, oh, now I understand why it's offensive to her. Because their intent, they're going to, I have good intent, Jason. I care. I like women. That's what you
Yeah.
hear all the time. Of course you do, but the problem is your behavior. And do you see how this might? And they're like, no, I don't understand that as a microaggression because I'm a good person.
Yeah.
I don't mean it that way.
Yeah.
They need to take it differently, right? They don't have to own their own behavior. So inclusion is hard because they don't have the fundamental vocabulary and understanding to understand the concept of what's going on in these every time you ask women to take the notes in the meeting.
Also, I think sometimes I don't know whether it's human nature, but I think more often than not, that's what I'd like to say. More often than not, as people, we want to be seen as good people.
Exactly.
Like I'm a good person.
Yeah.
And so if somebody comes to you with the way you treated someone was wrong, and if it wasn't clear I feel like the knee-jerk reaction is, oh no, I could never have done that. Like I'm a good person though. I have
Exactly.
I'm not racist.
Yeah.
I have black friends.
Yeah.
Like it's that
Exactly.
it's
Exactly.
that sort of line, and it's just
Yep.
it's really important, I think, when, well, for me anyway, I find with when we're talking about microaggressions, it's not saying that you're a bad person. It's actually teaching you to look outside of your own bubble.
Exactly.
And come from a perspective of how do you think that sentence would have been received by someone else?
Yes. And it takes practice and repetition. And I think that's what's been missing is I get a one-time training on microaggression. And my first response is, yeah, those things are terrible, but I don't do that because I'm a good person, good intent. It's not about me because there's no examples. But if I say, no, the reason you're in this room is because all the women in your team feel like they're treated differently based on a microaggression. Let's have a conversation about microaggression. And then all of a sudden I've connected the dots for number one, why you're in the room, why you need this training, why you need to practice, and what the intended outcome is, inclusion. And so we know what tool I need to use to increase inclusion. I think right now what happens is people know inclusion is important, but they're never given a tool. So they don't know what they're supposed to do. It's like, yeah, I know it's important. I'm a good person. I'm good. I just move forward instead of saying, no. Here's exactly what I need you to do.
Oh, well, Jason, I've thoroughly enjoyed our conversation today. I think your book is definitely one. It's not just a simple read, and I say that in a positive way because it really does provide leaders with the tools to actually be able to go out and do good, which is important. I think we need more books like yours. So I'll definitely be linking down below this episode a link to your book for anyone who is listening. They'll be able to purchase it. And also, if anyone wants to just connect with you in general, what's the easiest way?
Yeah, so you can go to our website, Cape Inclusion, and then of course my email is just Jason at Cape Inclusion. Happy to help. We do quite a bit in the consulting space. So and then the books Diversity Inclusion Matters on Amazon, so any of that works for me, or any local book retailer can. It's published by Wiley Publishing, so the book's out there.
Oh, fantastic. So just before you do leave us though, what would be your one piece of parting advice that you would give to DEI leaders of tomorrow?
Take care of yourself. I think it's very heavy, and a lot of times you're experiencing the same thing people come to you for. And it's okay to take time for yourself, and it's probably the most important thing. I think that's another reason we see a lot of burnout is people don't ask for help, and it can be very, very heavy. So I encourage you. I see a counselor once a month. I think we should be honest about our mental health and very open about it. It's okay to be hurt by what you see and for it to impact you individually, but you don't have to suffer in silence. So I'd really encourage people, get in this space, ask for help, and take care of yourself. It's really important.
Oh, thank you so much for sharing that, Jason. With our viewers, I think I couldn't agree more. I think it's so important that we take care of our own well-being, especially DEI leaders, if of any people really, because it's a heavy load. that you've got to carry. So thanks again, Jason, and I look forward to speaking with you again soon in the future.
All right, thanks. Yeah, thanks for having me on. Appreciate it.